everybody. Thanks for sticking around. This is going to be our last panel of the day, and we do have another musical act after the panel as well. So this is the Indigenous Urban Experience panel. We've got Michael Redhead Champagne, we have Dr. Monica Sinclair, Angie Tuesday, and Sean Loney. So welcome.
Tanse, everyone. Welcome. My name is Michael Redhead Champagne, and I'm excited to be hanging out here with all of these awesome folks to close out the Winterruption educational awesomeness that's been happening here at the West End Cultural Center over the last number of days. Today, we are going to be having a discussion about the urban Indigenous experience. So for our non-Indigenous audience members, buckle up.
Okay.
So we are going to begin in a simple fashion by asking each of our guests to introduce themselves in the way that they feel comfortable, and then we'll move on to additional questions. And at the end, we'll have an opportunity for folks to ask questions. And so I just want to point out the fact that we have a question and answer stand microphone over here that folks are welcome to contemplate while we're talking. Also, note that Winterruption is active on the social media channels, and so if you take photographs or have thoughts that you feel like are important for us to amplify outside of this room to others, you're welcome to tag Winterruption on Instagram and Twitter. So, with all of that being said, the purpose of our panel today is to explore Indigenous experiences in an urban environment. And so, that is the question that I'm going to leave hanging while we leave from that question for a moment to ask each of our guests to introduce themselves. And maybe what we'll do is we'll just go down the line. So as I said before, my name is Michael Redhead Champagne. I'm originally from Shamattawa First Nation, and I do a lot of work in the north end of Winnipeg. Today, as moderator, I'm mostly here as a listener, and so I'm pumped to be able to hear from all of our different guests. I'm going to go right to my left, your right, and I'm going to ask Dr. Monica Sinclair to please share a little bit about herself.
Okay. Tansi Kiwaitin Nutumiskwe. I'm originally from northern Manitoba. I lived in the city for 30 years now. And I've lived here because I mainly moved to the city because I came here for school and fell in love with education, and just continued on until I got my PhD, and now I'm, I guess, imparting my knowledge wherever I can and with whomever I can, because I think Indigenous ways of knowing and doing are really important for people to understand, not just Indigenous people, but non-Indigenous people, because we are the caretakers of this land, and so for me it's really important that I got my education not just for me, but for all the people behind me and all the people in front of me. Egosani.
So much. Next up, we have. I guess we could just. You can just introduce yourself.
Gonna leap in.
Please, no, please do. Please do.
Thanks. So I'm Angie Tuesday. I'm Anishinaabe from Winnipeg. My family's from Big Grassy and Temiskaming, Ontario. I'm currently a family support and resource advocate with Winnipeg Police, and so in that role I provide supports to families of missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, and also men and boys, which is something I forgot to mention earlier. I've been doing this type of work for several years, but only just came on to the Winnipeg Police Service. I'm an impacted family member, and so I lost my sister in 1998. And so that sort of led me into this work. I'm a language learner. I'm also, I wasn't raised in the tradition of my family, and so I'm a learner, and I'm happy to be a part of this panel, and so thank you very much for having me.
Good day. My name's Sean Loney, and I grew up actually in Angie's traditional territory. My experience being different. Emo, Ontario, my grandparents owned a grocery store. My family still owns a grocery store. And in reflecting upon my upbringing, realizing there's a connection between poverty and privilege. And I recognized that the people shopping at my family's grocery store were from the Rainy River First Nations. And I have to draw that conclusion that my family's financial well-being was directly connected to the demise of the Ojibwe food economy. And moving to Winnipeg, I got involved in the social enterprise sector. So I'll be talking a bit today about how social enterprises can provide people with opportunities that currently don't have access to the labor market. Nice to be together today.
Thank you so much, everyone, for introducing yourself. And I want to start quickly by just throwing it back to Sean and saying, Sean, you didn't mention your indigeneity in your introduction. And for me, as someone, when we were preparing for this panel, we all thought, what the heck is a random white man doing? Can we say the elephant in the room? Okay, so why is Sean here? All right, and so Sean is here, I believe, and I'll let you defend yourself in a moment. I believe Sean is here because as important as the voices of Indigenous people are, our connection to Indigenous and non-Indigenous folks, our fates are intertwined. And I think it's important for us as we're having this conversation about being Indigenous in the city, is to be able to have an honest and self-reflective and critical, sometimes, voice of non-Indigenous folks, letting us know as the Indigenous folks sharing the experiences that we've had, that we're not imagining it, all right? And that there really are forces at play that are sometimes out of our control. And so I just think it's important to have that connection and relationship between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people, because we live together in this city. And so I just wanted to put the elephant out of the room and just throw it back to Sean quickly to say what you think about that.
Miigwech. So I co-founded with many others from Indigenous Winnipeg a social enterprise called Build. Some of you may have heard of it before. I think what it is doing is leaning into Winnipeg's defining issue, connecting the people who most need the work with the work that most needs to be done. And early on, I remember coming face to face with this lovely guy who had wanting to get out of gang life in the city. I said, I don't understand why you don't have a driver's license. Like, everyone has a driver's license. This is my very naive, privileged background speaking, and I'm just trying to understand why no one has the piece of paper that'll allow them to drive the truck to the job site where they can earn a living. And he looks at me kind of funny. He's, I don't know anyone with a driver's license. It was like, immediately, I just remember these aha moments. I was like, oh, yeah, all of these systems that we're interacting with, they're kind of built for me and my family. They work very well for us, but they're really hard on a lot of other people in Winnipeg. And so I think, Michael, what I'm able to recognize is that there are really two Winnipegs, and we would do much better if everyone had a good opportunity to thrive. And I think the other interesting thing in working in the inner city is realizing that the massive amounts of money that we're expending as taxpayers on managing these colonial problems, it's actually much cheaper to address the problems. And so the great news for me as a Winnipegger at working at Build and other social enterprises in the city is people who we see on the street, many of them, they may want to work. They may be fantastic co-workers, or they may do very well if with the simple support of housing. And I think that's just amazing news for Winnipeg, that we have a path to prosperity, and it lies in this Indigenous wisdom, which is a gift in Winnipeg, unlike any other city in Canada, that we just need to lean into.
Thank you so much. Thank you for saying that, Sean. And I'm just going to jump off on the point you just made about Indigenous wisdom, and maybe I'll go to you, Dr. Monica, because I think that as we are thinking about how do we amplify the Indigenous wisdom, it's important, first of all, to acknowledge where that Indigenous wisdom comes from and what application it could even have in the city. And so maybe I'll just pass it to Dr. Monica just to share a little bit about, have you seen Indigenous knowledge being applied in the city here, and what does that look like to you?
Okay.
Sorry, just, I know we had a whole preparation call, and it's all just out the window.
I guess as an Indigenous person, as I walk around the streets and I look at all the street signs and as I go down the roads, I don't see myself. Our signs are in English. If you go to some northern communities, especially in Nunavut, they do have their signs in their language, but here in the south, we don't. And even, I was just thinking about this the other day, even like the bike trails and everything, those were at one point Indigenous trails, because we used them for hunting and gathering, and that history isn't there. There's no placards to say that this was once walking grounds for Indigenous people that lived in this territory. Because I look at Assiniboine Park and they have that Assiniboine Forest and they have a whole history written there. But I'm always wondering if that's really truly what it was. And so there's lots of our history that's missing. And so as an Indigenous person, when I walk and I don't see myself, it's really difficult to become involved in that community. I know a lot of people in the city, but a lot of them, you know, like as an Indigenous person, we don't know our history. We aren't taught that. Like when I went to school, we weren't taught our history. I only know my history because I was really fortunate to be involved in groups where people talked about our history, and I was really blessed to be able to go to this economical conferences in Bear Butte and in Alberta when I was younger, so I learned about my history there. And I'm originally from the Paw area, so I remember the first time I went to a ceremony, I went running to our public library, looking in the books, looking for myself, but I couldn't find who I was. I found Champlain, I found the Hurons, I found the Tyendinagas, but no Cree. I'm Cree, Nahayan, but no Cree people. And so I started thinking about that. You know, as I walk in the city, I don't see who we are. And there's very few buildings, except for maybe U of W is starting to put some things up. They have the big star blanket on the Indigenous building, and then they have Daphne Ojig on the building right there, but otherwise we're sort of invisible. And if you ever look on the news, they always show people down on Main Street, and if the total opposite of that is if Indigenous people have, i.e., made it in this world, they're projected as people who are have made it in the world of business. And so to me, that's a contrast because I'm neither a business person, so I don't see myself in that category. But I feel like I belong in this community because I'm existing and I'm a human being and I'm being human. And so I think about our kids, and when they're walking the streets, they don't see themselves being represented other than they have to be a certain way, otherwise they're not accepted into this society. And if they don't make good grades, then they can't get into university, and if they can't get into university, they can't become professionals. And for me, that's the path I've chosen, was to go to university, mainly because I fell in love with learning, not because my goal was to become a professional something. I've had numerous places of employment, and I'm a contractor scholar, so I contract out my scholarly ideas. And I have a son who's in his 20s, and he's chosen a long time ago to be a musician. And so I've supported him in that, and I remember one time we were having a conversation about that, and he said to me, he was in grade 10, and he said, "Mom, would you be disappointed in me if I didn't go to university?" And I said, "No, why would I be disappointed?" He goes, "Well, because you went to university." I said, that's my journey. If your journey is to go to become a musician, then you be the best at it. You work hard at it, you learn more about the genre and what it means to you. And I said, my only thing is no swearing in your songs, no misogyny, no homophobia. So I named all the things, and I said to him, and try to include your culture into your singing, into your music. And so he's been true to his word, and that's what he's done. And for me, I think about parents who are unable to have those conversations with their kids, because I know for me, I'm only able to speak to my child the way I speak to him is through years of learning about my own culture. And it's the culture that has brought me back to who I am. Because when I was younger, I didn't know my culture. I didn't know who I was. My parents were in residential schools, so they raised us a bit different than most people. And so through that experience of living with my parents and going back to the culture, and I always hear elders say that culture is what will bring us back to who we are. And I truly believe that. I think that it is the culture that will bring us back to who we are. And when I look in the city, I don't see a lot of us being represented here. There goes Sunny.
Thank you so much. Go to Angie to share how you feel. Just react.
I was listening
How do you feel about
intently,
this?
and I lost
Yeah.
track of what the question was.
It's okay. Just we want you to be Indigenous in the city right now. So if you could just be Indigenous and be in the city, then that's what we ask.
Well, I can say like a lot of what you said like really resonated, you know. So my dad was in residential school, and there was a lot of things that happened to him, and it's interesting how that impacts you like much later down the road. So it occurred to me a couple weeks ago that I'm actually the product of colonization in that experience, and so in my work, what I'm trying to do is decolonize myself and like do a lot of that education work. But it's interesting because, yeah, growing up, I didn't read or learn about anything to do with the experiences of Indigenous people until maybe university, and that was a little while ago. So,
Someone who's reconnecting, I wonder if, as you go about the city, like, do you feel like you're being represented? How does the city speak to you?
I think there are a lot of efforts being done in a lot of different ways. So we're seeing a little bit more visibility, I think, like in terms of events, for example, around the city. So I think that's happening. But I also find, like, as someone who wasn't raised in the traditional way, it can be a little bit scary, I think, to embark on that learning journey. So I've had a lot of helpers. I've been working with community a lot over the past number of years, and so little by little I've started to sort of engage more, trust myself more to reach out. But I think too sometimes I think more needs to be done to ensure that there's accessibility, that kids, youth, even adults are being given that opportunity to find out more about their roots and their history. So,
Thank you so much. I think I'm really happy to hear you share these experiences, and I think it's interesting to see the way Indigenous knowledge can speak to us in the city, or is sometimes entirely absent in the city. And I'm going to throw over to Sean here for a second and say, do you see Indigenous perspectives speaking to you from the city?
Absolutely, and I see it as a solution to a lot of the problems that we see in Winnipeg now. I brought some copies of a book that I've written with some others called The Beautiful Bailout.
Shameless
And
plug.
For to give away, But one of the reasons why I brought it is that because it starts out with story of a moose hunter from 1905, and he's being observed by an Indian agent, so a representative of the government of Canada. And the Indian agent sees the moose hunter, this is a Cree moose hunter in the Capel region of southern Saskatchewan. I was amazed that I got the Indian agent's diary. This is where the story comes from. It's just very informative for me. And he sees the moose hunter come back, and he's shot a moose, but he's coming back to tell everyone in the community that he shot a moose. And the Indian agent says, "Why would you do that? Keep the moose for yourself, for your own family." And then the Indian agent observes these 15 women going out into the bush. They take the hide off the moose, cut it in 15 equal pieces, and bring it back to the community, and they share it. And the Indian agent says in his diary 2 words: "How peculiar." And I think we're at the point now to be able to say, how peculiar that almost half of the taxes we spend in Winnipeg, for example, are on emergency services. How peculiar we have this homelessness problem. How peculiar that 4 to 5 First Nations kids will have type 2 diabetes. And I feel like we're turning the corner in Winnipeg because the discussion we're having around reconciliation, around the impact of residential schools and colonial policies, I think are causing families like mine to be less judgmental and to be more curious, as opposed to saying there's something amiss here. And in the end, what I've learned working in the inner city and working in the social enterprise sector is that poverty is not about poor people. It's about the failure of the systems they're interacting with. And I'm kind of excited about that. It's like, oh, we created these systems that don't value solutions. Maybe we can create systems that do value solutions, which in the end I think is what the elders are saying is how their economies were structured for so long. So the Indigenous wisdom, it's there, and it's here in Winnipeg, unlike any other city in Canada.
Thank you so much. And I think that it's great that you shared that story of the moose hunter and the sharing with the community, because that makes sense to me and the experiences that I've had. One of my friends who was in child welfare was able to reconnect with their parent, who was an Indian residential school survivor. And at one point, when they received their Indian residential school settlement, that survivor went around with their money, and you'll never guess what they did. They started giving that money to everybody that they cared about, everyone that they loved. There were people that were saying things like, you should buy a house, you should buy a car, you should do, invest. And so one of the things that I thought was so fascinating about that is it really feels like that is a modern application of the story that you just told.
Yeah, how peculiar.
How peculiar that somebody would give away a bunch of money when it's so valuable. But to me, how peculiar that people would not do that. Like, it just seems strange to me that you would not do that. And I guess my question for the panel to think about is there a particular element within Indigenous knowledge that you think is like very obvious, that the city, like if the city of Winnipeg was a person right now, okay, and they were sitting right here on the stage with us, and we were able to say, here is one piece of Indigenous knowledge that I want you to use. I'm curious to know from the panel, what would you recommend? Because I know that for me, I'm also just reconnecting myself, learning about language and all of those things, and I've learned about the word Wokotuwin, and it talks about kinship, right, and family, and how we're connected to each other. And so not only are we related to one another as human beings, we're related to the water, we're related to the land, we're related to the stars. And so if we regard the environment and world around us and the human beings around us as if they are our kin and our family, we will make better choices. So that's what I would gift, if I could, to the city of Winnipeg, and hope that we hopefully could address some of those challenges that were mentioned: homelessness, child welfare, intergenerational effects, poverty, right? These are all terrible system things that disproportionately affect Indigenous people, but I truly believe that if we are able to center Indigenous knowledge, teachings like Wakotuin and others, that we can go farther faster. So is there anyone that has anything off the top of their head they want to share?
Go ahead.
I'm very respectful. No, just, one thing that popped out while you were talking is like you have to listen, right? You have to listen to what the elders are saying. You have to listen to what the youth are saying. You have to listen and hold that space. So I do a lot of work with families. I've done a lot of work in the courts and things like that. And sometimes we as service providers or we as people with information to give, we just talk and talk and talk and talk and talk, and we aren't comfortable with silence. And sometimes it's hard, I think, to allow that person to be silent, take it all in, but also to allow that person to speak and share what they need to share. I notice even in the few minutes that we've been up here, a lot of us are storytellers. And so, so I was watching TikTok yesterday, and there's a creator named Brando, and he really said something that made a lot of sense. Like, you ask for this information, or you're sharing this information, and you're getting a story, right? And the story can sometimes take a little bit, it can take a lot. But he said, like, I leave that, and then I have to go away and sort of consider that story, and eventually, it might not be right away, eventually the meaning that you needed from that story it comes out. And so that really spoke to me, and I hope I'm saying it, I know I'm not saying it the way that he did, but it really spoke to me about how the importance of really listening when people are speaking, so that later on, you can process that information, and you can either change the way you're doing your work or improving the way you're doing your work for the betterment of the community that you're serving. So,
thank you.
For me, I think the teaching that is very powerful and encouraging is just that solutions should be valued. What does that look like? The City of Winnipeg Police last year responded to 241,000 911 calls. And they're going because we asked them to go. That's how the system is set up. But the solution isn't, safe supportive housing, for example, isn't considered in the comparison. Oh, well, this supportive housing complex would reduce 911 calls by 2,000 a year. Well, what is the value of the police engaging with the supportive housing solution on those calls versus what would the nonprofit sector need for money to avoid those calls from happening in the first place? So I think it's a healthy comparison of business as usual, which is just what we've been doing all these years, sending out police and emergency responders to people who are struggling, versus love and compassion. And I think we'll find we do a monetary comparison of those two things. It sounds kind of crass, but love and compassion wins. So I just love the teaching that solutions should be valued. My ancestors, that is not embedded in our economic systems. But these are how really healthy Indigenous economies have been structured, and I think that's what it looks like in 2022 in Winnipeg, is let's value the solutions and have a comparison and choose the one that makes the most sense for taxpayers and for public safety. And I think we'll find that these Indigenous solutions are extremely worthwhile.
Thank you.
I'm next. I just wanted to explain, first of all, that I'm using Dr. Sinclair because I have my PhD, and mainly because that's what the elders told me to do. They said, whenever you're doing a public presentation, you have to use doctor. And for me, it's taken a while for me to get comfortable with that. because I'm really not about hierarchy, or I'm a person like everyone else. I just happen to be a little bit smarter, a little bit more tenacious. So I just wanted to let you know that. And secondly, I was thinking about what you folks were talking about, and I guess for me, when I think about the solutions and what I would say to the city is, you have to know that you come from a worldview that's different from our worldview. We see the world differently, and you see the world differently, and somehow, some way, we'll find a point where we can work together. But right now, we haven't been able to look at each other. Instead, what we do is we have a very bureaucratic system that has very specific rules, and we have, in our own way, our own rules and our own protocols and the way we do things. And even though people don't follow their traditional ways, they do understand that they're Indigenous people, because we're reminded every day of that. I'm reminded when I go to Shoppers Drug Mart and people decide they're going to follow me. Or if I go to the grocery store and some security guard comes and tells me, and keeps following me. So I'm reminded all the time that I'm Indigenous. Or if a little 6-year-old comes up to me and says, "Are you an Indian?" I just laugh and I go, "Yes, I am." So for me, I think as people start to recognize where they come from, and that means you have to know your relationship to yourself. You have to know why, for example, like, why am I driven by money? Why am I driven to buy that home? Why am I driven to do this? And why am I at all costs to do certain things? And people don't question that. Instead, they just keep doing that and doing that and doing that. And they don't realize that there's repercussions for them doing that, that it does, it hurts the whole economy of people. And so I think about that, and I think about like how our people still know our traditions. They may not know, as you were saying, the ceremony or anything, but they know the traditions of sharing. They know the traditions of caring, of love, because that's our first teaching when we're born. As when we're born of love. We were made by two people that loved each other, or we were born outside of someone else's body that loved us and decided to give us away. So that's the very first teaching we learn as Indigenous people, is that we're from love. And I always used to wonder, like in the 60s, there was a lot of songs about love. So was the world looking for that love because they didn't have it at that time? So I think about things like that. And I think about, like even today you hear a lot of songs about love. So people innately have that idea of love. And like you were saying, it's about caring and sharing and doing things together, because there's so many studies out there that show that people can't live without one another. Even if it's like a good morning, a hello, how are you? You wake up in the morning and if you have no one around, you feel lonely. And we're built to have people around us, and that's our genetic makeup. But if we don't listen to that, then we get all these problems that we have. We have suicides, we have kids withdrawing, and it's just, to me, it's very amazing what our elders know. They knew all these teachings, and I do listen to them, and I do try to take what they say. And part of storytelling is that, when you went to English school, you had to tell what the moral of the story was. And so if you didn't get it right, you got an X on it. But in our traditional ways, the moral of the story is what you make it to be. So it's you're living your story, and it's up to you to decide what it is that you're going to learn from this story, what it is you're going to learn from your life. And part of that is, when I was thinking about what elders were talking about in the story, I just realized oh no, I take what I want from the story and I leave the rest. I take what fits me and what makes me a good person and what makes me want to be well with everyone. And so I started thinking about that. They never tell you what the meaning of the story is or the moral of the story. It's up to you to find that. It's up to you to go and look for it. It's up to you. And so that's one of the things I've taken from the elders is the wisdom that they impart. And just knowing that, like, I don't always go to ceremony, but I know that living a good life means being well with people, treating people with kindness, showing up when I say I'm going to come to something, and only if I'm on my deathbed will I not show up for something. Like right now I have a bad cold, but I'm still here. And so to me that's what's important, is having that relationship with people. And when you have a good relationship, you have good communication, you have good ways of working with people. And so those are the kind of the things that I've been taught, and I try to incorporate those into my life every day. Sometimes it's challenging, but what can you do? Egasani.
Thank you so much. I think it's, I just want to acknowledge the beautiful wisdom that was just shared here and thank all of you for what you shared. And I want to just pick on very quickly something that you shared, Doctor. And I actually love calling you doctor, I have to say. Calling an Indigenous woman doctor makes me feel like so good because I'm like, it just feels right. So I know it's hierarchy, but I'm like, Indigenous women run shit, and that's how it's supposed to be. And so just saying, I love calling you doctor. So when I think about Winnipeg and Indigenous people, it's impossible to separate us from winter. All right, now this brings us back to Winterruption, right? The idea here that it's winter and we live in a city where winter factors into a lot of things. And so I was here yesterday and I was giving the panelists a hard time from over in the question and answer space. And I ended up asking a question that I think is important here. Every winter, primarily Indigenous people die from the cold, from exposure, in a city, in between buildings, where there are heated buildings that have security guards in the buildings that are protecting the buildings. Somebody save the buildings. And then Indigenous people pass away every single winter. This year, there's an initiative, an Adinaway Mac, that's working with OPK initiative. They're making something called the Sabe Peace Walkers and doing all sorts of stuff, trying to have an Indigenous owned and operated warming center to prevent that very thing from happening. But we know that despite all of those efforts this winter, another person passed away from exposure in Winnipeg. And so my question to the panel is, how can we stop having primarily Indigenous people pass away from such preventable things in the city, like all the time? Like every winter, I hate that there's always Indigenous people. It's always Indigenous people dying. And so I asked the question yesterday of the panel, not knowing really what answer I was hoping to get from folks. And I think I'm in the same position here today where I don't actually know the answer that I'm looking for, but I just know we need to ask that question, I think. And so I'm just curious if anyone here has any thoughts about how do we build a better relationship with the winter and the city so that Indigenous folks aren't disproportionately the ones literally dying.
Wow.
So big question, I know.
It's a big question. I guess for me, what I do is, I don't know if you know about those hot pockets. I carry those around with me. And if I see someone being harassed, I do stop. My son has witnessed me doing that, and a couple times he's gotten scared. And I keep telling him, you know, when the Creator thinks it's my time, it'll be my time. But otherwise, I'm just going to keep fighting the good fight. And so, for me, I just remember all the people before me that that gave up their lives so that we could live. And so we could live to help those around us. So that's what I try to practice as much as I can. And I do other things, like I carry extra mitts, and then if I see someone and they talk to me, I talk to them, and then it's that whole notion of companionship. So no matter how much I'm in a hurry, and if an Indigenous person wants to come and talk to me, I'll come and talk to them. And so that's what I can provide, is just even a moment of helping them realize that they're humans. And I think that's the biggest thing, is we have to recognize that everyone has a story, and people are not choosing to be where they are. Because I have a lot of homeless relatives in my own family. I've had a sister who passed away homeless. And so I know the struggles that people go through, and for me, just to reach out and talk to her once in a while was all we could do as sisters. And I think about the brothers and sisters out there, and that's all I can do is just give them some companionship, and giving them some love and some decent human contact. And if I have the hot pockets on me, and if I have an extra scarf and I have extra mitts, I give that away. And if I have food, I give that food away, and bus tickets. So whatever I happen to have, I'll give, because I know that I've been really fortunate in my life, and $20 isn't going to break my day. So those are kind of things that I do in my daily life.
Thank you.
I think building on that point of sharing, like I think the responsibility too has to be a shared responsibility. I think it's important for initiatives to be Indigenous-led though, because I think those folks who are in that position to help, they're the experts on what might be needed for that community. But I also think it's also important to look at probably policies around like fire bans, for example. Like I'm thinking of all those things because sometimes a shelter or warming space, that might not be the safest space for people, and we have to look at what's going to be a safe space for people, what those folks in that experiencing homelessness might be actually needing. Like, are they needing a place to put up their own shelter, for example? And I know that there's people are of two minds on that, but I think it's worth a conversation. So I don't have any specific answers, but I think the responsibility needs to be shared with all of Winnipeg, because we're all a community, and we're all we all have some ideas to share, likely about helping our families who maybe are experiencing homelessness.
Great question. For me, I think a systems level response is asking ourselves, how is it that we connect what it is that we have with what it is that we need? And the need is obviously more supportive housing and more affordable housing. What is it we have? My goodness, we have all kinds of things. We have 500 vacant boarded up houses in the inner city. We have an amazing caring foundation community. Winnipeggers don't know that the Winnipeg Foundation has almost $200 million invested in real estate. It's not invested in Winnipeg. It's not even invested in nonprofit housing. But if governments were to look at things differently, see things differently, investors like the Winnipeg Foundation would see the benefit of getting a financial and a social rate of return. So it's not their fault that opportunity isn't available, but we need to liberate that kind of capital. And I think we need to look at the enormous amounts of money we're spending on emergency services, responding to people who are in perpetual crime, and instead of having a debate about more police or less police, let's reduce the workload. Let's go hard on starting with people who are in most frequent contact with emergency services, which turns out are people generally who are homeless, are a big part of that. And just realizing that a comparison is going to show that giving the police the tools, a new tool to engage the nonprofit sector directly to help them reduce their workload. That, I think, is some aspects of how do we not just manage this problem, but how do we really address it quickly? And I think Winnipeg can be leaders in North America on how we do that because of all of the things that we have. We have one of Canada's probably the most vibrant nonprofit sector in the country. The nonprofit sector knows what to do. Many of the nonprofits are led by Indigenous Winnipeggers with Indigenous wisdom and philosophy and governance built right in there. And we have the resources. We absolutely have the resources to address the problem. It's just that the money is going to managing the problem rather than solving it.
Thank you. I feel like we're just beginning to scratch the surface, but I already have to go to the question and answer period for the audience. So I could keep asking y'all questions all day long, but I feel like we have some amazing leaders in the audience that also will be considering and thinking some deep thoughts for us. So bring it on, audience. Holy mackerel. No, gently. Bring it on safely. Bring it on safely.
My apologies, chairs. When you guys all got up there, I heard the conversation, mask on or mask off. I see 4. In the world where we're going from, the post-COVID world, where do you see Indigenous knowledge informing our decisions of like supporting BIPOC communities, Black, Indigenous, and people of color? Because the pandemic affects most of the BIPOC communities.
I think that as we move forward, I feel like we've heard a lot up here about the importance of compassion. And I think I'm wearing a hoodie today, actually, that says Minnepamatsu in the good life, right? And that even was also referenced. We want our relatives to have a good life. And so I think that if we use the teaching of Minnepamatsu as somewhat of a North Star, it can help us make decisions. If we want to have a good life, we make the decisions that allow us to have that. But if we want to make sure others around us have a good life too, then we, make whatever decisions are appropriate in that moment. That's why we had that conversation when we all came up here, and we're all making the choice that is most appropriate and makes us feel safest. And so, it's compassion and kindness, and when other people disagree with you, that's okay, but also I'm still going to take my responsibilities seriously in the way that I understand it best, and I do have an expectation as well that the folks around me will do the same. So I think that's my big answer. Anyone else?
I guess for me, I know traditionally we had our own, BIPOC community or whatever, and gay and lesbian communities, and they were just part of the community. They weren't seen as different or outed or anything like that. They were just part of the community, and that's how I was raised. My mom raised me like that because we do have 2 gay people in our family, but my dad was totally different. My dad was very homophobic, and so because of that, I've learned to just embrace whatever it is that needs to be embraced. And I think that a lot of our communities are, right now, are starting to recognize that there are many people out there who aren't being acknowledged. And because of that, like Michael was saying, that we try to be empathetic, sympathetic, and do everything with kindness and love. And I think that as a community, we recognize that there are so many different people out there, and that everyone's welcome because we're we're just spirits having a human experience. That's what I've been taught. So, like, it doesn't matter. It just, love is love is love is love.
I think I would add, like, you know, I have a lot of learning to do, so I do a lot of the learning I take from the community and the people that I work beside, and also the people I support as well. So I think a lot of that we have to learn, right? We have to learn from the experiences of BIPOC people, of the LGBTQ2S communities, and all those other people who may have so many more barriers that maybe we're not aware of as service providers. But I think it's important to learn. That's why that goes back to the teaching of listening, right? Mm-hmm. Knowing when to and listen to the people. And so that's a lot of what I do in my work. And I would say that it's a really, it's probably one of the most important parts of my job, right? Is to listen and to hear what the barriers are, so that and also some suggestions on how to remove those barriers or minimize those barriers, so that people can you know, be and live in the community. So that's what I did.
I'll come around to the mask in a sec. My ancestors are largely Scottish, and I've been to Scotland a couple times to research how it is that they got 5,600 social enterprises there, businesses that are hiring people with barriers to employment. And you can just think about that in the Winnipeg context. That would be 400 social enterprises in Winnipeg whose purpose it is, businesses whose purposes it is to hire people with barriers to employment. And I was on the bus transit system in Glasgow in Scotland, and the woman recognized my accent wasn't local. And she said, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Oh, I'm researching social enterprises." And she knew what it was. And she says something to me I'll never forget. She says, "Oh, they're very civilized, aren't they?" And so this is such an interesting term, because that's what the residential schools and colonization was supposed to be doing to the Indians, is civilizing the Indians. And now I feel like these Indigenous business models are actually civilizing us. And so the connection to the masks, I think, is that we need to look after each other. It's not just about what our own comforts are, but what is it for people that are around. So when I'm in close quarters inside, I think it's important to wear. And if you're not speaking publicly, it's responsibility to be a little bit uncomfortable so that the community can be much better off. I think it's an analogy that's worth carrying forward. Good question, though. Thank you for asking it.
Thank you.
Miigwech. A lot of excellent points brought up today, and I appreciate, you know, that you're willing to come out and speak to all of us today. I had just a comment and sort of an open-ended question related to, I think, Monica, you brought up early on kind of the indigenization of, you know, urban spaces and what that looks like, you know, in Winnipeg. I feel like across Canada, more than most cities, we see a lot of Indigenous iconography and, you know, designs, and that's starting to be woven into the fabric of the city. But I'm straddling the line, and I flip back and forth on my thoughts on this. But you know, there are some very real issues going on in our city where people are losing their lives. You know, like, it's kind of a question of, you know, where the money goes, and, you know, what are we dedicating this money to? And yeah, it feels often sometimes like, you know, is it representation, or is it pandering? You know, it kind of feels like that at times. It's like, do we really need another monument or a big statue of an Indigenous whatever when people are losing their lives on the street, you know? And so yeah, that's just something that has been racking my brain. Like, representation, obviously important, but when that money could be going to, saving lives, like what are we really doing here? So I don't know if you have thoughts on that or what your take is. But
What's your name?
Holly Monkman.
Holly. Can we just give it up for Holly, everyone? Because I just think that question, I feel like you should be up here with us with a question like that. So thank you very much for asking that. I'm going to ask each of our panelists to answer that question in their closing remarks because I think it was such a great way for us to finish up. So we'll start with Sean and we'll work our way down. So representation or meaningful change. What do you think, Sean?
Well, I think it's important because it helps us understand our shared story. That's when I see artwork or like just in your saying, Doctor, the bike paths were Indigenous trails. Of course. I never thought about that before. Absolutely. And if there's something there that can make me think about that, I think that's important. I've worked on a book with Jim Leonard, who's a former chief of the Rainy River First Nations, and it's a travel guide about the Rainy River region, but it's about our shared history as settlers and Ojibwe and Métis. And some places on the river tells a story about how we got the relationship exactly right. And some places, like residential school site, it tells a story about how we got this relationship totally wrong. So I think having it present makes the invisible visible and helps us, that's right. Yeah, these used to be trails that were used. It makes it conscious for us. So I think it is important.
I would add I think representation is super important because it reminds people that we are impacted as Indigenous people by colonization, by policies that are in place, by historical practices. We're still impacted by that today, right? And I think the thing that I was thinking about while Sean was responding is that that impact doesn't only happen on September 30th, doesn't only happen on May 5th, doesn't only happen on October 4th. It happens every day. We're being impacted or we're experiencing something that's related to that history. And so I think by having that representation around the city is really important. Also, I would add that it's really important to have that representation outside of the downtown area, outside of the North End as well, because we're all over the place.
We're all over the place.
And so I think that's really important, and I think it reminds people of that fact, right? Like, it reminds people that Indigenous people are here. We've been here forever. We'll be here forever. And so that's why I would say that representation is really important. And it also, because in my role, right, I work with Winnipeg Police, I'm in a system. We are working to make changes sort of within that system. And I think like having panels like this, having events that maybe aren't as focused on the losses that we've experienced, we're focusing on the good changes that are happening. I think that helps also to have some hope for the future too, and to see that we're moving forward in a good way.
Thank you. I also think that representation is important. I also think that it's important that we have policies in place that do give funding for various projects. And I think that's happening, because it wouldn't be happening because we have a lot of groups that work with homeless, and we have like Nadinaway, and so we have a lot of things happening in the background that's never voiced or told to the world. So I believe that a lot of like policies and like your work, they're all coming together at the same time. And yeah, to me, representation is very important because it does remind people, and it also tells me as an Indigenous person I belong here and that I'm important. Because I think about my own life, and I was never seen. And I also know that my role and responsibility, like I'm no longer a young person, and so the role and responsibility of a young person is to bring forward those questions and to bring forward those thoughts and ideas, because that's what will keep me going, is knowing the people behind me are raising such great questions. That was a great question. And it makes me feel proud that there are people in this world that are going to continue that voyage and continue that protest and continue that talk, because it means us older folks are doing our job. We're doing our job of raising good quality Indigenous folks, good quality Indigenous people, good quality people in general, because the more the young ones can keep bringing good questions, it just keeps reminding me that, yeah, the work I do now is going to help those behind me. And so I always try to keep the door open. And no matter what I do, like I said, I just try to keep that door open because I have to. It's my responsibility. And that's what I've been taught. And so, can I ask him for the question?
This brings us to the end of our panel. I'll very quickly just say that I think we need both representation and meaningful policy change and spending. So my answer is both. Sorry. It was so, you just said such beautiful, like I was like, oh, we should end it there. We should end it there. But I'm like, I'm just gonna say the simple version, both. Thank you so much, everyone. Please join me in giving it up to our amazing panelists for bringing the energy today, bringing the ideas. And as we know, these folks do amazing work, and so not only are we honored to hear them today, but I want to encourage all of you to follow the work and activities and adventures that these folks get into, because it's gonna be a good time. So thank you all so much. My name is Michael Redhead Champagne. It's been a joy to be with you today, and I'm gonna pass it over to Joey, and as I do so, please join me in acknowledging and saying thank you to Joey and the entire team at Winterruption for what they've done here over the last few days. Thank you so much for generating such important conversations for our city.
Thanks a lot, Michael. I really appreciate it. Thanks, everyone, for coming. This conference has been really great. We've had some amazing speakers. We have had some amazing conversations. Obviously, these conversations need to continue, so we do need to keep the conversations going with everybody and with our city. So I really want to thank all the speakers for coming out for this whole week, and hopefully we can do this next year, and I hope everybody appreciates it, and we'll keep talking. Stick around, though. We do have Johnny Moonbeam coming up in a few minutes as well. Thanks a lot. Give another round of applause for everybody. Thank you.